I've been to a number of the all-university conferences in which discussions of teaching take place, and these discussions are characterized by great emphasis on the question and relatively little in the way of new information on the characteristics of the phenomenon. Good teaching has some of the characteristics, I think, of electricity. It's relatively easy to say what the effects of electricity are, but it's rather difficult to define. One of the surest ways of winning a discussion on teaching is to ask your adversary to define teaching and then proceed to demolish his analysis. And I've seen that happen on a number of occasions. But I gather that this series has had as one of its principal purposes consideration of the effects of the research emphasis in universities with a graduate orientation on teaching, and particularly on undergraduate teaching. Is that essentially correct, Mr. Pearson?
Yes, sir.
And certainly this is a subject which merits consideration and justifies great concern. I think that perhaps the question about good teaching might be rephrased in terms of the further question, what is this good teacher good for? In other words, what kind of a good teacher is he? Certainly there's no single attribute which can be pointed to which takes into account all of the people that we might think of in our past experience as having been good teachers. I might cite a couple of illustrations of people who by some definitions of good teaching would be regarded as abominations, but by others would be regarded as distinguished teachers. In the 19th century, as many of you know, one of the most distinguished historians was Leopold von Ranke. Leopold von Ranke, by all accounts, was a terrible lecturer. The historian George Bancroft went to hear Ranke on one occasion, and he described the performance at this lecture essentially in these terms. Little Ranke, apparently was about 5'4" or 5 feet 5 inches tall, was just barely visible behind the podium, and he would leap up from time to time and spurt out incomprehensible jets of rhetoric. This is a paraphrase of Bancroft's description. By the standards that we heard yesterday at the Senate meeting, that the Distinguished Teaching Committee should visit a lecture and make its judgment on this basis, Ranke wouldn't qualify, obviously. But if one were judging Ranke in terms of his effect on graduate students, teachers of history who in turn taught other teachers of history, one would have to say this is one of the great teachers of the 19th century. He was particularly effective in graduate seminars, and obviously completely ineffective in the lecture room. I think perhaps the inverted morality tale which one reads in the Daily Bruin almost every year, and which has not infrequently featured our department, the Department of History, is one which misses the point, perhaps, with regard to the characteristics of good teaching. You've all read this. It's now being played out, I think, at Tufts University. The distinguished teacher, the great teacher who doesn't publish, is dismissed, while Professor Dryasdust, who excretes occasional monographs, maybe many monographs, not only remains on, but receives accolades and is advanced in the hierarchy of the university. And this is a case, obviously, of vice triumphing over virtue. You read this every year, almost. We haven't yet received this year's edition of the Daily Bruin with this particular emphasis, but I'm waiting for that issue to appear. Now, this suggests almost a dichotomy between the research scholar and the teacher. A great teacher and the research scholar. I think that's a false dichotomy, and perhaps in the later stage of this discussion we can elaborate on this point. I think the dichotomy that ought to be emphasized more at the University of California and elsewhere is the dichotomy between the intellectually alive and the intellectually dead. There are teachers who don't publish who are intellectually dead. I'm using the term teacher very loosely here. There are people who publish and are intellectually dead. Might be described as almost human vegetables so far as their vitality is concerned. I'll cite one illustration. I don't want to monopolize this discussion, but I'll cite one illustration and I will subside for a while. A number of years ago in a university which perhaps just as well left unnamed, the professor of American history, recent American history, was delivering a lecture on the peace conference at Paris in 1919. The year was 1939. This professor was a scholar who published substantial, unimaginative monographs. He was lecturing on the peace conference, and his notes had the characteristics of too many professors' notes, somewhat dog-eared, a bit musty, and he had the habit of reading his notes sitting at the table. And he apparently was reading his notes much too closely, because he referred to the Peace Conference of Paris in 1919 as last year, which by internal evidence indicated when these notes had been written. It's been suggested that the cause of teaching and scholarship would be promoted by a fire and faculty officers every 5 years. This may be an overstatement, but it certainly would perhaps promote fresh approaches to the work. Now, an important part of this man had died, but to set this man up as the epitome of the scholar, and to set the teacher up as the man who's continually refreshing himself for the latest research and producing for the benefit of the student body, undergraduate or graduate, the latest in the thinking of others, is a false dichotomy. I could point to, of course, other illustrations of people who had not published at all, who were also using dog-eared lecture notes. Now, I'm not quite sure, I said this would be a fresh discussion, I'm not quite sure whether we're supposed to focus in this discussion on the evaluation of teaching at UCLA in particular, the University of California in general. If that is the case, then perhaps a little later on I'll make some comments about that.
Just add a few things to what Professor Galbraith has said. In thinking about this, it seemed to me that one proceeded through two steps. First, to try to identify, to the extent that one can, what the components of good teaching are, and quite clearly there are none which every person whom one characterizes as a good teacher possesses all of, but there must be some in common. And secondly, after one has tried to identify these, then to consider the process of assessing their presence in any given individual whom you're trying to evaluate as a teacher. When one thinks, as Professor Galbraith himself mentioned, of the good teachers in one's own past, they vary so widely that it's very hard to find any universals. They're the people who are so magnetic and so dynamic and brilliant themselves that they start a school essentially and have disciples who for 20 years will try to emulate them and teach what they have learned from them, and gradually this will be changed by other people, but their effects are profound, not only on the people whom they are immediately in contact with, but through them on the whole field in which they are. The person in my background who fits this most description is Linus Pauling, who is a very remarkable lecturer, and he affected the whole world of chemistry through his teaching and his research both. But then there are others who don't have that attribute at all, but who are remarkable in the way they can do what Pauling did, and that is force you to examine problems in a new and different way. And I would say the attribute which, at least in my judgment, every good teacher must have is the ability to arouse and challenge people intellectually, not just on a short term, but on a long-term basis. That is, not just to have them coming away from the lecture having idea that they've seen a brilliant new illumination that they'd never noted before, but rather that a week later or a year later or 5 years later, they still have retained something from this. They've been stimulated perhaps not by any single experience, but by the exposure over a period of what we call the artificial organization of a course, or however one wishes to organize the exposure. Then another thing that a teacher should do is develop the critical ability of his students. One of the best teachers whom I've ever had any contact with, I never had him in a class, but I audited courses of his after I was a faculty member here. And he was a man who, by, quote, modern standards, unquote, never got through the subject matter he was supposed to cover in the course. That is, the people he was almost ready to retire at the time. And the people who were 30 or 40 years younger thought he was, didn't know what the latest material was, didn't get it all covered, that they had to tell the students some of the modern things so they'd be up to date. But he, in a unique way, developed the ability of his students to look at a problem, analyze it in great depth, not necessarily understand all of the modern ramifications, but to get them to the point where they could go on their own without having merely a superficial acquaintance with things. And that attribute, many of his students have done brilliantly themselves. They've gone far beyond where he ever went as a scholar, and they attribute their success to the fact that he developed their critical faculties. And finally, another attribute which a teacher has to have is flexibility, because, of course, the students you run into are so varied. They're all human beings, and they're, particularly in a place like UCLA, they're of every range of intellectual ability and of motivation and everything else. And you can't treat them all the same way. Some of them are over-organized and over-disciplined. That is, they're highly motivated, and they do everything in the right way, but they never would think to question what you say. And others are hypercritical and thoroughly undisciplined, and their main object is to show how bright they are, but they don't appreciate the value of hard work and the tedious labor that's needed in scholarship. So you have to see all of these things and get at them somehow. Now, with regard to evaluation, I was sent by Mr. Pearson a summary of these previous lectures, and I noticed that almost everyone is, with a few reservations, universal in saying that student evaluations aren't worth much. I disagree pretty strongly with that. I think student evaluations are worth a great deal. I would agree that rating forms as such aren't worth much, and that's in the same sense that no prescribed form is worth much for learning anything about the relations of human beings. You have to examine each one separately. But student opinion, if you find mature students, they are much more perceptive and in many cases much less easily led astray by, quote, popularity, unquote, than many of the faculty think they are. I'm sure that all of us have had the experience of knowing good teachers at the time when we were in college, and of thinking they were good 15 years later. Our opinions haven't changed very much. Sometimes we were led astray, of course, but not always so. And it seems to me in evaluating teaching, you have to get the judgment of the people who have been exposed. Some of them may not be current students. They may be students who've been away 5 years. But I think student opinion is the most valuable source, at least in my mind it is. Now the trouble with evaluation is that the products of good teaching are aroused human minds, and there's nothing objective about a mind. You can't tell whether or not. It's like any uncontrolled experiment. If you don't know what would have happened to this mind if he'd never been exposed to the teacher. If he's a brilliant student, he might have done just as well if he'd never been exposed. And you can never go back, of course, and repeat it with an identical twin who didn't get exposed. So that the uncontrolled aspect of the experiment makes evaluation very difficult. But nevertheless, it has to be done. Statistical evidence is useful in any psychological experiment. About all you can do is use statistical evidence, but in fact, if a teacher has produced 10 remarkable human beings, this may be of more value than if he's made dullards, than if he has produced a lot of fairly good ones and no remarkable ones.
Looking over to the left-hand side of the table, I suppose some uneasy stirrings are to be expected. I hope I don't put anyone to my right in an unfortunate position that they would obviously not fit in. Perhaps it's because time has been going on that I've been fidgeting a bit. But I would like to start my remarks by first of all questioning whether the use of dichotomy, dividing things into dichotomies, is necessarily an adequate way of thinking or an adequate way of evaluation. That is to say, it separates us into research men or teachers, researchers or teachers, and then denies that there can be such a separation. That is, the man who is skilled in research, who publishes widely and profoundly, is almost by definition a good teacher. I don't want to put myself in the position of saying that, on the other hand, merely because a man does not publish, he is therefore a good teacher. But I would nonetheless like to extend perhaps the concept of dichotomy into a slightly wider spectrum of things. And I simply will assert that within my knowledge and experience, limited as it may be, I have known men who are very skilled scholars and profound scholars who are not great teachers and who are not good teachers and who would be better off as research professors, in my opinion at least, and this should be their appointment. On the other scale, on the other end of the scale, that is within the scale of viability, I have known, and I think some of you have known, great teachers who have not, in fact, published, and who have distinguished themselves by having the ability, and this is my definition of the teacher, a learned man with the ability to think logically, profoundly, and stimulatingly before a group of students, be it in the lecture hall. I'm not quite sure how this goes on in the laboratory, but I do know a bit how it does go on in the seminar. So to limit the teacher to the concept of one who presents himself before a class, I think is also to limit our conception of the teacher. In between the teacher. I could cite a specific example of a man whose, to my knowledge, only publication was a note published in 1923, but who is and has been, in the opinion of good upperclassmen and of distinguished graduate students, one of the greatest teachers they have ever encountered. Such a man on our campus is my conception of stage one, at least, of the great teacher. And such a man should be retained on a university faculty, is sorely needed in many instances, and should go on in his career without being halted or detoured. In between and rare example though it may be, the scholar who has no ability to present his findings logically, profoundly, or stimulatingly before a group of students, be it in the classroom or in the seminar room. I think we have people in between who perhaps should be accelerated because they are productive as scholars and adequate as teachers. And then one step closer would be the man who occasionally publishes. I think of Tolkien's article on Beowulf. Now, Tolkien is not a publisher that a recent historian, still alive, I believe, at the Huntington is, who wishes to instruct literary historians on how to read literature. He doesn't have that great elephantiasis of words. He doesn't have that flowing river of phrasing. But nonetheless, Tolkien's article, had he never published another damn thing, would have merited his retention on any university campus, although I seriously doubt that he would have been retained here. So we have to look at the man who publishes occasionally, but publishes with distinction when on his occasional outbursts, and who at the same time teaches adequately. As if we're going to take this chance, now I'm sure there'll be disagreement, and I hope I haven't misrepresented the position. At least I wanted to expand it. I don't think it's quite as sharp a cleavage between the research man and the teacher as the term dichotomy implies, although I may have just stretched that a little wider. I think if we are to evaluate a man on the basis of his teaching, that there should be some attempt at least to look at a man as systematically for his teaching as we now look at him for his publication. Perhaps this should be done on a voluntary basis. A man who believes that his chief contribution to the university is through his teaching perhaps should be given the option of requesting that he be reviewed as a teacher, and if found lacking, then he'll have to go the way of all flesh. I would hesitate, at least now, to make this compulsory, but I think it should be a voluntary option. Now, what would the man be reviewed for? I think he should be willing to submit a syllabus of his course. This doesn't tell us very much, other than that he can organize his materials, and that he does take the trouble to do so. The second thing, it seems to me, is to submit, if he wishes, again, on a voluntary basis, the lectures that he has prepared for his course, if it is a lecture course. And this over 2 or 3 years, so that one can see where he has, in fact, grown, where he has changed his point of view, where he has added to or corrected statements that have previously appeared, that he is constantly in the process of increasing his own learning and of communicating that to the students in whatever the size of the group. I think, too, one should also look at the readings he prescribes. One can judge, I think, in part the quality of a course through the sort of readings that are used. How many of them are secondary? How many of them are anthologized? How many of them are from unrevised editions that are still kept on the plates simply because this one man uses them. And I've known of instances of that, an anthology that was preserved 10 years beyond its death by the simple fact that the Department of English required it still in its sophomore survey. I think, too, he ought to be willing to submit, let's say, his final examinations. Are they relevant to the course? Are they, in one way or another, provocative of thought and of deep and searching thought, and perhaps some of the results of this? I think in addition to helping the department review the course as he presents it and the contents of the course, that the man who wishes to be reviewed for his teaching skills should also be able to present some evidence, or we should be able to get some insight into the imagination, the imaginativeness with which he presents his materials. Now, I do not mean to imply by this that he should accompany his lectures to a guitar or to a recorder, or that he should walk in with a thunder jug inverted on his head, as a colleague of mine at Berkeley was fired for doing when he presented Sancho Panza. I think probably this is playing too much to the gallery. Nonetheless, I think we ought to look at the imagination with which a man does present his materials. Now, although I have other prejudices on the matter, I think now that Tom Jacobs has been able to rest from the battle of the freeway, that's one thing perhaps would help improve our teaching. Shorten those damn freeways and get us closer to campus. But I would like to reinforce Kenny's remark. I believe that student comment, and it would have to be rather guardedly obtained, and one would have to question the source to be sure. That student comment can be very valuable. I've been told time after time, and I have witnessed it in operation upon occasion, that the student grapevine is amazingly observant and penetrating, and that one can put a certain amount of weight on it, or at least use it as a means to go further into an investigation. I don't want to use investigation, an examination of the man's skills. This might be, we might ask people in senior honoraries. We might ask graduate students. It's not always possible, especially for a young man in a large university, to have turned out graduate students. I know from the response in the Committee on Distinguished Teaching that sometimes in small departments or long-established departments, a few men have very zealously guarded their graduate seminars, and consequently look all the more impressive when the fact really emerges that this has been a monopoly. And so it's hard for young men, I think, to get statements from graduate students, unless through some sort of departmental colloquia. I think we ought to look at this, in the humanities especially, far more actively than we do now. Unless he's impressed the graduate students by the quality of a paper read or a discussion led or his organization of a panel or something of the sort. I think, too, that we ought to get down to a system of faculty visitation in which at least, if it's an assistant professor being reviewed, he has a friend in court on the committee that examines or visits him. And I think above all, we have somehow to get at the sense of impact that the faculty member makes on his colleagues. It's not always visible in his publications. It's not always visible in the impedimenta of the course, but it is often quite clearly discernible when one talks, as we all do, you know, sort of past 45 and past the age of sexual vigor, we simply degenerate into garrulousness about our colleagues. But in that garrulousness, we usually talk about someone who has made an impact, whose ideas are vividly presented, are actively engaged in, excitingly demonstrated, and who makes a stir in the department. And we know it. Well,
sure that I'm not a little inconveniently placed, what with the freeway on the one hand and the extreme left on the other, by way of starting this. I suppose it's a measure of the problem that you tend to talk about evaluating teaching on the basis of personal experiences rather than on the basis of some explicit, objective kind of standard for measurement. I'm currently involved at the moment in talking about criteria for evaluating students for performance awards, and I think there's probably some sort of analogy that might be drawn between this kind of a task and the kind of task that evaluation of teaching involves. As soon as you start talking about performance awards, say in the area of music, you leave behind you the convenient index of the grade point average. And similarly, I think, in the context of evaluating teaching and teachers, that you also lack these kinds of objective standards. You tend to think back on the people that you recognize in your own past as the good teachers that you've encountered. When I do so, the 2 or 3 people that come to mind that would be preeminent in this background represent quite different kinds of individuals. One I recall took us through material in substantially the same way that he would take us through the writing of a book. Lessons, in effect, were lessons in the development of chapters, and the assessment of evidence was the assessment of evidence that could go into a convenient paragraph somewhere along the line. In short, it was didactic, it was analytical, it was close instruction, while another that could be identified said almost nothing about the apparent subject matter of the course, except occasionally to explicate the parts that he thought would be most difficult. For the rest, the assumption was that the student could get it from the secondary sources. The personal element in it, then, would identify quite different kinds of skills, quite different sorts of responses to different individuals, different styles of teaching, as you get into this kind of matter. Also, from a personal side, the teacher can raise the question about what he expects in terms of responses from his own classes. And I confess this has always been a difficult kind of a matter for me. Obviously, a considerable number of students in any lecture class are going to make a very immediate sort of a response. They're ready for what you have to say, in short. Their level of preparation is substantially congruent with the kind of things that you want to do. But there are many others within a particular class that don't make that kind of immediate response, and you can frequently go through a semester without having any real sense of how much rapport you've established with a considerable part of a class. In short, we're dealing with something here that runs across such a broad spectrum that the question of what you're trying to evaluate, the question of what sorts of things are involved in any kind of assessment of teaching is a basic kind of a question. In some instances, the teaching obviously needs to be the kind of teaching that imparts a very specific kind of a skill. If you're talking with students who are advanced enough so that analysis of particular bodies of material is essential, the kind of teaching, I think, that is most valuable is the kind that is associated with those who themselves are the best analysts of this kind of material. In short, there'd be a very close connection with the research activities that the faculty was pursuing. If by good teaching, on the other hand, the thing you want to evaluate, you're talking about something that is a kind of great awakening in the student, and this can be a very valuable part of the experience of any student, you've got something quite different indeed. In short, I think that the discussion of the evaluation of teaching is something that is usually conducted in terms of two stark contrasts. The teacher who gets little appreciation because of a paucity in the research record is opposed to that individual who is so committed to his research that he's scarcely interested at all. But perhaps because these are extreme cases, they don't represent the generality of the people who most students, I think, come in contact with, who fall between the middle of the range. My feeling on this, then, is that it's considerably easier in the case of most people who are teaching students in universities and colleges to come to an adequate assessment of the quality of their teaching that is usually supposed and perhaps is presupposed in a set of meetings of this kind. It always seemed to me, for example, when I was writing letters about people within a department during a period of chairmanship, that the department as a whole, and me personally, had a very clear sense of whether or not the individual was a good teacher, whether or not he was getting the kind of response that a class would want to applaud or that a department would want to applaud. I think there are criteria, that is to say, even though they depend in the end on considerable personal judgment, that can be created for the assessment of good teaching within a university, within a university situation. I would suppose that the first one would be a general sense of the seriousness with which the individual approached the problem of teaching. That is to say, the seriousness of the objective that was involved. And as you go through various departments, these kinds of attitudes are, I think, fairly easy to identify. I would put this almost at the head of any list of criteria that I would put together. I think another kind of thing that is fairly clear to other members of a department is the preparation that a student brings from one class to another. It's pretty easy, that is to say, to begin to get a sense of the effectiveness of teaching in these terms. The kind of sequential development that is involved in most bodies of learning permits this kind of a judgment, if not within narrow terms, at least within serviceable terms as you move along. A third element would be this response of students to instruction, and I would put it definitely within third place. As I mentioned before, some students are at a level of interest and a level of preparation so they make an immediate response to the teacher. But a considerable greater number, I think, are yet learning, and their response to teaching may be a delayed response. Many an instance can be cited of the student who is appreciative of the role of the teacher 2 or 3 or 4 or more years after the course has been had. Student response then is a valuable, but I think a shaded kind of an element within this kind of assessment. Now there are other more particular things that could be pointed out. But generally, if you were to depend on these three, anyone within a department, I think, would have a pretty good idea about what his colleagues were doing, what his colleagues did in the realm of teaching and how effective they were at it. I think that this problem of evaluation, then, is not only posed in terms of extremes that are much too stark to cover the generality of cases that you deal with, but equally in this connection, that too much is made of the difficulty of establishing serviceable criteria for the evaluation of teaching. Indeed, I think probably the greatest problem that would be universally recognized would be the matter of time that would be available to the instructor, to the teachers within colleges and university, to do the sort of a job that they would like to do. Personally, I know that I've never had a course which had to be a strictly lecture course, say with 100 students, in which I've not felt dissatisfied with reference to a considerable number of the members of the class, simply because time doesn't stretch to the extent necessary to follow up on the kinds of things that can be started, but only started within a lecture kind of a situation. My sense here then is that there are very real problems, to a considerable extent, problems that are involved with the problem of numbers in this kind of matter, but that evaluation of teaching is a problem that can be met, that appreciation of teaching is something that is more widespread than frequently is assumed in the university, and particularly in the student community.
Thank you, sir. The man on my right is not present to respond to Professor Kinsman's comments with regard to the nature of the dichotomy. I thought that the point had been made quite clear that it was a false dichotomy, that what we're concerned about was vitality and the evidence of vitality, which might appear in a research scholar and might appear in a teacher, but was not necessarily associated with either the research scholar or the teacher. Now, I'm impressed by the degree of community represented in this group, and I'm doubly sorry that the man on my right is not present. I think among the points which have been made, which might be stressed, is the variety of attributes which may be involved in good or great teaching. Professor Kinsman has mentioned among the sources of evidence which might be presented, syllabi, lecture notes, I believe, were mentioned among others. And I think by these criteria, the two greatest teachers in my experience are both eliminated. One came to class with a few scribbled notes, which I'm sure would have been indecipherable to anyone but himself. The other violated every rule in the book, and every book that I've read on good teaching. He brought an objective quiz to class each day, and we all know what that means and the characteristics of a teacher. He further indicated that if there were discussion throughout the period, then we might not have to take the quiz that day. And the response is predictable. The class would think of questions to ask this individual. By every criterion except one, this man was a poor teacher. The only thing that he had was genius. At the time, my reaction to this man was that he was the most infuriating individual in my undergraduate experience. I did not rate him as one of the great teachers at that time. As I advanced in years, and I hope in maturity, I recognized that what I had been infuriated about was this man's getting to me as no other teacher did, as no slick performer. And my judgment as a freshman is not my judgment as a senior in this particular case. This, I say, indicates the problem that's involved in the evaluation, but Professor Kinsman did make one comment with which I do agree, and that is that the colleagues of a faculty member know a good deal more than usually appears in promotion letters with regard to the attributes of his teaching. All of us have had the experience of reading department chairman's letters. So-and-so is a good teacher. If he has not published much, he is an outstanding teacher. But there's no elaboration. I return to the comment that I made earlier. I want to know what he's good for and what he's outstanding about. What are his characteristics which make him good or which make him outstanding? And there's a good deal that can be said about one's colleagues, which I say unfortunately do not appear in evaluations. I think that this tendency, if it is allowed to continue, is a most unfortunate tendency in the University of California. I would hope that those committees which are involved in the evaluation of individuals would send back letters of this sort to department chairman and ask them to write them over again. In other words, I hope that by Mr. kinsman's definition of heaven and hell, I'm on the side of the angels. I'd like to provide more evidence or more recognition for distinguished teaching, and I'd like to have the evidence presented for this distinguished teaching. Professor Kinsman has mentioned that one of his distinguished teachers would not qualify in the University of California. He has also pointed to a colleague who is in the University of California who I understand has not published at all. So it's possible for a person to be retained in the University of California without publication. And I certainly do not agree that the number of publications ought to be the measure of the man. I return again to the note which I began. The decisive question is vitality and the evidence of vitality in the individual.
Well, I don't have a lot to add. I had jotted a note while Professor Kinsman was speaking saying almost exactly what Professor Galbraith has said, namely that what one is interested in is intellectual liveliness over a long period of time and how you can predict this. You have to extrapolate for 30 years on the basis of 7 years. And certainly evidence of scholarship is one way of suggesting that a man is interested enough in his field to keep alive in it, but it's not the only way. As a measure of the extremes that Professor Jenkin mentioned, one might consider as the ideal of a teacher Socrates, who imparted almost no information, asked only questions, and on the other extremes, the Jesuits of the 18th and 19th centuries who developed teaching to a very high art and to a considerable extent stressed memory above all else, although not exclusively that, but developed a great many very fine minds. But these represent the extremes, and as Professor Jenkins said, in most cases one doesn't find these qualities to an extreme in the faculty members one has to evaluate. One way in which one could ensure that people keep alive or get thrown out is to abandon the tenure system, of course. This would cause great difficulties in terms of intellectual freedom, obviously. And the difficulty at present is that one must decide about tenure at an early stage, and one tries to do it on the basis of whatever evidence one can get in a fairly short period. And it seems to me that under these conditions, it's the character of the man you have to look at much more than any other quality that he has. Oh, one other remark. I did promise my Chemistry 1B class that I would come back at 5 o'clock for a review session, thinking that this would be over, and when I hear it's going to last till 5:30, I think I'll probably leave about 5:10 or so. So please excuse me if I get up and walk out in a few minutes.
I'm sorry, I seem to be guilty of a defect in vision. I don't see a man to John's right. My point is, I don't think we should get down to a personal retort. It was a false dichotomy, but the false dichotomy was in suggesting that the scholar and research man can be divided. And I have known at least where, well, all right, let's drop it then. And I certainly agree that the major point is the vitality with which a man presents himself, be it in one field, even a third field is possible in a campus this large, as the political science department in particular is discovering, and that is where a man continues to teach and continues to publish and may also be, dread word, an administrator. I would quite agree that to evaluate a man solely on, and this certainly wasn't my intention, the basis of his syllabus or his lectures would be fatuous. I think this is but one piece of evidence or one set of evidence in a fairly wide spectrum of evidence that we should be trying to assemble. I'm not sure that there is such a thing as specific objective criteria that can be applied to each one of which can be applied to a specific man. But I think we would all seem to be in agreement that it is a professional necessity. There is no substitute for what is ultimately a professional judgment, and that we do make this all the time upon our own colleagues. If it's defensible and mentionable, I think it should be brought forward. But I still think that if we are going to seek to assess the vitality of teaching, we will still have to resort to some sort of objective criteria and spread that criteria out in a considerable scope. If a man is deficient at one end of the spectrum, he may have tremendous evidence at another end. If his syllabus is confused or non-existent, if he has no lecture notes, I know, for example, Leon Howard, awarded this year a Distinguished Teaching Award, simply does not lecture from notes. And I know another man in the department who does not seem to lecture from notes, but who very carefully and with great devotion, having changed his notes, is ready for his lectures an hour ahead and prepares himself with great labor. It's a terrible effort for him to talk, and yet his lectures are brilliant. I'm sure lecture notes from him should not be expected. But I think, on the other hand, if we can't do it this way, we can also press on to the imagination of the presentation. We can also seek for leads, at least, through student and faculty suggestions or formal visitations. And once more, I repeat, it seems to me the necessity for evaluating the impact that a man makes on his peers.
Dr. Jenkins?
I'm not sure I can address this topic, eighth in the row, without duplicating either myself, previous statement, or what others have said, because as Professor Galbraith has indicated, there seems to be a considerable harmony of views on major points. I would hope that the matter would come to some discussion here to give somewhat more point to the reason for the selection of this particular topic here. The assumption is that, or the assumption that I would make in it, that there are problems that the students who have set up this series have encountered in their personal responses to teaching that would explain this kind of explain the emphasis that is contained in the selection of this series of topics. Perhaps part of it could be, part of the answer could be reached by the reaction that graduate students have to their own problems of teaching, and a considerable number of them do so. That is, again, there's a personal dimension in this, and I would like in the discussion to hear something of the reaction of graduate students as teachers to the problem of teaching and to their own evaluation of their own work, or to the evaluation of the work of their colleagues in the same position. To reiterate what's been said before, then, I think that there are possibilities for evaluation, that it's a matter that does get a considerable gets a very high value within the rubric of the university generally.
Thank you very much.